So welcome everyone. This is Breakout Session 1, and it's the session on data sharing and transparency. There are two other sessions, and so make sure that you're in the right session, but we're on data sharing and transparency. My name is Keiji Fukuda. I'm the director of the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. I used to work at WHO and CDC, and I will be moderating this session with my colleagues. Now, we have about an hour for the session, so we'll try to end pretty close to 10:30. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, or actually ask them to introduce themselves. But before doing that, I want to do two things. Just let you know how we'll run the session, and then just set the scene for what we're going to talk about. So in terms of the method of work, or how we're going to do business, basically, there are 4 questions to the panelists to get us started. And we'll hear from the panelists about their thoughts on this. And then after that discussion, the audience will have a chance to ask questions. And so please think about what you might want to ask and type it in, and then we'll try to get to those questions in the time. So in terms of setting the scene, before I get to the panelists, let me just say a couple of reasons why we're talking about this. For any outbreak situation, major outbreak situation, there's critical information which is needed by everybody. We need warning that there is an event or a danger going on. We need a description of what's going on so people can start getting ready. And then we need some very specific information. We need viruses and related information like genetic sequence information, in essence, to develop pathogen-specific defenses like diagnostic tests, vaccines, medicines, and so on. Now, one of the things that we've learned from the past over and over again is that rapid and transparent information sharing cannot be taken for granted. And there are a number of reasons. There are structural reasons or operational reasons. There can be political or societal issues, including a fundamental balance between the sharing of viruses and information and the sharing of the benefits coming from those information, such as vaccines. So today we have a terrific panel of very experienced and expert individuals to help us understand these issues better, and really to help us work through what hopefully are the basis for some realistic and durable solutions to address information sharing. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and give some of their past experience in data sharing related to emergencies. So I'd first like to call upon Dr. Celia Alpuche Aranda. Celia, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Keiji. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop. I'm Celia Alpuche Aranda. Currently, I'm directing the Research Center for Infectious Diseases at the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico. I was former director of National Referral Laboratory for Epidemiological Surveillance of the Secretary of Health of Mexico during H1N1 pandemic. And currently I'm working to help the health authorities in the COVID-19 response, particularly in the technical aspect of diagnostic, and also as coordinator of the National Independent Technical Advisory Group of COVID-19. My previous experience during H1N1 pandemic in sharing information, samples, and so on among the 3 North American countries was based in previous engagement, building relationships based on trust among the technical people. So it worked pretty well, at least for us here in Mexico, and it helped us to build a response from very limited structure by that time to a much better condition in a very short period of time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Celia. Good to see you again. So can I call upon Dr. Kanta Subbarao, an old friend and colleague? Kanta.
Yes, thank you, Keiji, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm Kanta Subbarao. I'm the director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Reference and Research on Influenza in Melbourne, Australia. I was previously at the National Institutes of Health in the US, and before that with Keiji at the CDC influenza branch many years ago. So I'm an influenza virologist by training. I'm a pediatric infectious disease physician as well. But I've been working on influenza for about 30 years. And in my current role, am very involved in the global influenza surveillance and response system. And those of you who heard the previous session know some of what we deal with in terms of vaccine strain selection and the issues surrounding that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kanta. Can I now call upon Dr. Joshua Sharfstein? Josh?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm Josh Sharfstein. I'm Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm a pediatrician and formerly the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I was there during H1N1 and have also written a bit about transparency in regulatory agencies.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And then Professor Johnluca Burchie, another old colleague and friend. Johnluca?
Thank you, Keiji. Indeed. We shared many battles back in WHO. Good afternoon. In my case, I'm in Geneva, Switzerland. I am a currently adjunct professor of international law. I'm the only non-doctor on the panel, I think. Adjunct professor of international law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And with particular focus on global health law and governance and international organizations. In my previous life, I was many years in WHO, 18 years, where I got to know Keiji and we worked together. I was the legal counsel of WHO for about 11 years. At pioneering time, in particular, the revision of the international health regulation, the negotiation of the PIP framework, and the first baptism of fire of the new system of health security with Ebola, with the H1N1, with the beginning of the Zika outbreak, and so on. So my interest fundamentally from a legal and institutional and governance perspective.
Right. Thanks, Gianluca. So, everyone, I think the first thing I want to do is just make sure that we all understand what kinds of things we're talking about. And so, the first question to the panel is that, given the trends that we see in technologies, the current and foreseeable trends, when an outbreak is first detected, what are the data and things that you believe should be made immediately available to other countries, to industry and scientists, so countermeasures such as vaccine can be developed as quickly as possible? So, Celia, maybe can you get us started on this?
Yes, thank you, Keiji. Well, I think as we experienced this time with COVID-19, the prompt release of full viral genome sequence through a public access platform was incredibly useful to develop immediately molecular diagnosis and to understand the trend of the epidemic, also to initiate vaccine and treatment development. It's true that technology is a lot upscaled in comparison to the H1N1 pandemic 2009. We can get sequencing very fast. So those hundreds and thousands genome sequences already available through GSAID and other platforms are absolutely useful for the entire world to a better understanding of many characteristics of this pandemic. However, epidemiological data sharing is also very important. We need not just count cases, at least we need some harmonic parameters to be able to adequately compare the data among regions or countries and to fully understand the spectrum of the disease and transmission parameters. This time, the amount of scientific evidence of all types going public is amazing, and it's very good. No matter there's a big one problem, that it hasn't been enough access for everybody to reagents for diagnostic or to PPE or vaccines or potential treatment. Sharing information in regards of other aspects, such as how to go for industrial transformation, help to be more self-sufficient in each country, that would be excellent for much better preparedness and response, or to have repositories of companies to purchase reagents and chemicals that they have been proved by different institutions. That would be great also, because that was one of the obstacles that we have for a better response, at least in the initial diagnostic and so on. And as I mentioned before, I think that to share information among the different countries, it has to be built in advance, based on trust. Because if not, we are going to all the legal documents and it can be an obstacle to do it immediately. Thank you.
Thanks, Celia. Kanta, can you pick up on what Celia has gone over?
Sure. So I come at this also from a laboratory science perspective in addition. So to me as well, the immediate sharing of sequence data was critical and would be in a future pandemic as well. But it's important also to share the virus isolates. It's not sufficient to only share the sequence. We really need these viruses. And both the sequencing and the virus sharing has not been uniform. It's been really quite commendable, but it has not been uniform. So that's something to aspire to. Sharing of information on the characteristics, both epidemiologic, clinical, and virologic characteristics as they are learned, either by the people that first identify it and then subsequently by others. So sharing of the information is also really important. And then, of course, we're now dealing with the inequities in vaccine distribution. So in addition to everything that leads up to it, when we actually have vaccines or monoclonal antibody cocktails or treatment strategies, we're seeing COVAX in action, trying to distribute vaccines, but you don't see quite that much discussion about how the monoclonal antibody cocktails can get to other parts of the world. So I'd like to add that to our list of things to aspire to the next go around. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kanta. So Josh, you have a different background from a laboratory. Maybe can you add your perspective?
Sure, I'd just say that certainly we saw at Johns Hopkins where the map that Johns Hopkins put together started getting thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and ultimately billions of hits. All the data that was made freely available by the team that put that together was downloaded so many times around the world that there's just an incredible, value of good data from every part of the world to be in one place that people can actually access and analyze. And I would just emphasize the point that sequencing is very important, but it's also the data related to sequences, such as whether people got treatments, the nature of their clinical course, whether they've been vaccinated, that really helps for global surveillance. And I think we've learned through this pandemic, it's not just the initial identification that's necessary for surveillance of the virus, it's everything that happens afterwards, given how much the virus has changed. And perhaps there should be, more consideration to a standard data set that we would expect and could be supported, through resources that countries could contribute that would include not just a certain amount of sequencing and viral isolates, but also the associated data about the individuals so that people could really understand much more quickly what's happening with the virus as it changes.
Great, thanks, Josh. Johnluca, you've dealt with this issue for a number of years at the global level. What are your thoughts?
From a technical perspective, obviously, I defer to my colleagues and I don't have much to add. I think that they said all the things that I would have said. From a sort of more governance institutional perspective, one point that is not always immensely clear to me is once the sharing takes place, with whom do we share? So for data, for example, COVID has really launched GSAID as one of the platforms of choice, where the contributor can retain title to what is shared, where there are some conditions for access and so on. But I know that there's a number of other platforms out there, both for safekeeping samples, so isolates, and for retaining data. So if there is more certainty sometimes from the point of view of isolates, I think that the at least to my knowledge, the question of retaining, and how to grant access to data is a bit more in a limbo from an international perspective. So I think there is probably need for more uniformity and clarity to avoid sort of bad surprises down the line in terms of strings attached to how to utilize either the samples or the data and so on. So yeah, it's more from the downstream perspective than the upstream.
Okay. Well, I think your answers highlighted some really important issues. There's a broad range of information which can be considered important. I think Josh raised the issue of whether a standard data set, for example, could be held up as a model. Kanta raised the issue that the sharing, Celia pointed out that a lot of information has gone around with COVID, but Kanta has pointed out that distribution or sharing has not been uniform. And so there are issues there. And I think Johnluca has raised an issue which we'll get into in a little bit more about, to whom does the data go? What is it used for? And that raises up a different set of issues. So I think one very basic question, though, is that if we're dealing with an emergency, we really want to know what we can rely upon and what we're going to have to sort of deal with on an ad hoc basis. And in an emergency, a lot of it is ad hoc. So the more that we can rely on something, the more critical or more important and helpful it is. So the second issue I want to raise to the panel is that given the experience of COVID-19, but also the other large events that we've gone through in say the last decade or longer, can we rely on this kind of critical information being made available reliably? And if you think it can be, why do you think that? And if you think it can't be, why do you think that? So, Josh, can I maybe start with you and get your thoughts on that?
Sure. I would say there needs to be some serious soul searching about the sharing of data of different kinds after this pandemic. And I think that starts with just the beginning of the pandemic and what happened, in understanding that, and elevating a potential pandemic threat. But I'll focus my comments just for a second on the regulatory issues where I'm most familiar. We have just a vast disparity in how much data is available about different vaccines, for example. There's no real global standard for what should be released about vaccines before they get used, and countries are having to rely on sort of the say-so of other countries without being able to analyze the underlying data. And even if data is published, it may not be satisfactorily reviewed before it's published. And I think that that's insufficient. It's insufficient because it's important for everybody to know the nature of how well vaccines are working before they're buying them, before they're using them, before their populations use them. And I think a standard of regulatory transparency for the vaccines, at a minimum, the standard that the U.S. followed with a independent evaluation of the data and a full, independent review being released along with the advisory committee meetings, I think that's probably the minimum that I would think is appropriate and totally feasible for every country, to do. And I think that would just, make it much more clear what the world is dealing with, what resources we have. That's one aspect of this. I think there are other aspects, though. I don't think the current situation really prepared us well for the transparency needed for the world to battle a common viral enemy.
Great. I think we'll come back to the transparency issue and maybe how we can look at issues such as the sharing with regulatory issues, I think, in a bit. Johnluca, can I turn to you and get your thoughts here?
Yes, so I understood your question as in a crisis, can we rely on the fact that people that have the pathogen will share it? And I would like to talk about both the isolates, the samples, and the data. I don't think so. I mean, if we look back in the last 20, 25 years, I think we had very random practice from the crisis back in 2005-6 with Indonesia and H5N1, to Brazil refusing to share Zika isolates for the longest time and forcing researchers to go to other countries or go to Puerto Rico that was less restrictive, all the way to China sharing very early on the genetic sequence of COVID back in January 2020. So there seemed to be a certain lack of consistency. The point is that at times of crisis, holding on to a pathogen, even a pathogen that can spread, so it's not like a monopoly on the access to that particular pathogen, but can mean political leverage, can mean power, can mean the possibility of negotiating access to benefits. So I think we have a tension between, in particular in the scientific community, I would say, I think it's in the ethos of a scientist to collaborate and share versus the increased politicization of the very act of sharing, which has been also increased by, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about it later in the panel, by Nagoya Protocol, by rules that have in a way legitimized this almost transactional access to certainly to isolates, not yet clear about the data. So I wish we can say, yes, at times of crisis, we can always rely on access. But I wonder. I think what we've seen in the last, I would say, 20, 25 years, quite mixed, at least from my perspective.
Kanta, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what's been said already. And I mean, I would hope that the answer is yes, that we can. But the reality is that it has been patchy. And I'm hoping that at the end of this, we look back and learn a bit and learn from one another and see who has shared and where we've benefited from information that came our way. I do worry going in the future about the need for continued awareness that a new pathogen could emerge, and that you have to remain on your toes and have the surveillance systems and the transparency to talk about it when it does happen, which I think is something that, it has to be something that is identified and committed to by people all over the world. Because, it's one thing to recognize a cluster of atypical pneumonia and then go in and find the cause and share that information. If the background rate of pneumonia is high enough and people aren't looking for clusters that are unusual, so you know what I'm saying. It's a matter of having both the awareness to identify and the wherewithal to identify causes, and then the transparency to share it, that we really need to encourage and figure out a way that we all kind of internationally commit to doing this.
Celia,
Hi. I mean, other than the political or economical or socials or all the legal networks that they have been talking about, I would like to mention some things about more specific, like that there are differences among the countries how to obtain and collect the information. Thus, no matter it's very important to get the information as soon as possible, we really need to be careful in comparisons. At least we need minimal parameters to have them in advance to assure a minimal quality assurance for laboratory surveillance, for epidemiological data, models, to trust the information we are seeing. And these can be built in advance if we have more networks that they can address all these issues before we are in a crisis period. For example, we are seeing comparisons of case fatality rates in different countries that we even don't know the laboratory capacity of the surveillance models, also, and so on. So it is hard to see if the data is absolutely reliable if we have such a difference among the different regions or countries.
So I think in your various answers, Celia, you were, I think, really highlighting some of the structural and operational challenges of local sites. Johnluca, I think that you were really highlighting that beyond the kind of structural issues that we face, there are simply differences in the political world and the scientific world, and there are maybe differences in norms and standards of expectations, behaviors almost. But an outbreak brings all of those things together. I think some of the issues, Josh, that you raised about the regulatory world and whether we can expect standards of transparency. Again, I think when we come to possible solutions, it'll be very interesting to get your thoughts on how we might move ahead with that, because I think that it's interesting for myself, having been involved in a number of these discussions over years, depending on the perspective of the party, different aspects are highlighted, the structural difficulties of poorer countries, as opposed to can there be standards of quality, which often get highlighted by a different group and so on. So I think that we can maybe get into this when we come back to how do we address the issues that are being raised now. But I think this is a good time to go on to the third issue or question that I wanted to get your perspectives on. So in global discussions and regional and national discussions, it has been argued that the flip side of sharing information has been that countries and companies which develop the vaccines and medicines and other benefits have an equal responsibility to share those benefits. And one of the challenges, or depends on how you think about it, one of the issues which has been raised is the Nagoya Protocol, which does take an almost transactional perspective on this kind of information. And I think that one of the tough challenges right now as we deal with COVID, but think about preparing for the future, is whether to try to tackle information sharing and benefit sharing together, whether they are a bundle which have to be addressed together, or do we try to tackle them separately? I think it's a very practical issue that we're going to have to grapple with, because we're going to have to deal with these issues. So maybe for this issue, Johnluca, can I ask you to get us started and give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's obviously it's a one of the biggest issues now, but I think that in a way, the train has left the station. The idea that the giving access to what by now more and more are considered part of your genetic resources, even though there were a lot of resistance, as you know very well, KJ, when we negotiate in PIP in considering pathogens that in a way want to kill you, that if you can, you would like to eliminate, to consider it part of your biodiversity. But I think there is a growing, if grudging consensus that that's the case from a political and legal perspective. So to give access to part of your wealth, of your biodiversity, has to go together a sense of something in return, of benefit. So by now, I think everybody sees it as a bundle, at least as a starting proposition. But there's a number of issues there. There's more clarity, I think, on the access side, because there is a longer tradition, there is longer habit, longer practice. What benefits are is more difficult to conceptualize. And many countries see benefits very differently. And from this point, if you allow me 30 seconds of shameless self-promotion, we just finished a 2 years project research funded by a Swiss foundation here at the Graduate Institute, precisely on the practice on sharing more pathogen than data, beyond influenza, where there is more clarity. So in the non-influenza world. And it's clear that in many cases, benefits are considered in almost individual academic terms. Benefits is co-authorship of a paper, in participating in a grant and being acknowledged as an institution. In other cases, there is a much more political approach. So benefits, in some cases, a financial return or capacity building or having commitments to sharing, for example, vaccine, reagents, and so on. So it's quite fragmented, the way in which benefits are seen. So if that's the case, it's more difficult to have a consistent conversation at the international level because you have a diversity of reactions and perspectives. But as a general proposition, I think they have to be seen together, and rightly so. I don't see why they should be separated, because it really smacks of like this sort of neo-colonial imperialistic attitude, which has prompted the work on a biodiversity regime to begin with, to fight biopiracy, to fight very abusive behavior by sort of Western and Northern industries for too long. And I'll be very happy to share, if you're interested, the report of our study that has been just published a few months ago.
Yeah, I think that'd be great if you could share that. I'm not sure the mechanism, but Josh, can I turn to you? And do you agree with Johnluca? The train has left the station. It's a very difficult issue to tackle together.
Yeah, and I appreciate, I think everybody here has much more experience with this particular issue than I have. This is probably the thing I read the most about in preparation for today. And, a question that I would have is, let's say we're going to take these two things together, access to the pathogens, but also sharing of the knowledge and the resources. It seems to me it's hard to negotiate that on a pathogen by pathogen basis. That you have the pathogen, now let's have the negotiation. That seems like a very inefficient and dangerous way to proceed. It would be better, because both of these things are necessary for global control of pandemics, both sharing of information and sharing of supplies and knowledge and other critical resources, that both of them should be handled, sort of in parallel, and they can cross the finish line together. So it's not dependent on a particular negotiation. It's just that we have a global framework for sharing vaccines and therapeutics and supplies. We have a global framework for sharing information about pathogens. Both of those are true. Everyone is bound by that in both cases. And so, it's sort of a exchange at a much higher level than the transaction that I think has been happening, with some of the particular disputes. We should, I think, take it out of, it's my country today and here's what I'm pressing for, rather than, a more general set of expectations for countries and the world.
So Josh, are you putting a plug in for the so-called pandemic treaty?
I am, in general, in favor of those kinds of agreements that really help the world understand in advance how things are supposed to go, so that people can act in the interest of the world right from the beginning.
Thanks. So Celia, you have represented a country in a number of these issues. How do you see this? Celia, you're on mute.
Of course, I'm coming. I have the bias coming from a middle-income country, but if we see the balance in the current most successful pharmaceutical intervention available for COVID-19, so I'm talking about vaccines. The big problem is for sure equity access to vaccines. The real life is that countries with vaccines production within their territory have preferential access in conditions of limited supply globally. We believe that during the H1N1 pandemic, and again, it's here, low and middle income countries without production capacity, even if we are not expecting donation, even if we are sharing all the information that we can, and we can buy these products, we need to be online. We need to be online and to wait, even if we are not even feeling the needs to protect the most priority risk groups. So I think there are different ways to address these issues. One is of course, the global access mechanisms that we have now in place is an excellent idea. However, for several reasons, it's being delayed, and it's very important to analyze carefully what's going on and to improve it for future response. Also, we need to increase local or regional capacity as much as we can. And I'm talking about maybe in middle-income countries that we can help other countries in the region, and also to favor more equity in limited supply conditions, accept globally that we need to protect the risk groups priorities around the world, and then go for other populations. So it's a very complex way to say we need to put together sharing information and benefits, because at the end, there are so many other factors that they are going to be involved. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Celia. So, Kanta, you've represented national and WHO perspectives. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much more that I could say. I mean, I would love to see a situation where influenza and the zoonotic coronaviruses and so on are exempt from the restrictions, because I think they're caught up in something that was probably not the original intention, and to actually have a mechanism by which they would be exempt from things like the Nagoya Protocol would be really valuable. Now, in terms of whether it does appear that the sharing and the benefit sharing will be bundled, and that makes sense. But I think that there's a greater awareness with this pandemic and the scale of the pandemic that now we're seeing well beyond just the initial development of the vaccines all the way down to the rollout, and the inequities and the vaccine nationalism that Celia is talking about as well, where essentially if you aren't a vaccine manufacturer if you don't have a vaccine manufacturer on your soil, you're really taking a number further down the queue. So I think those sorts of things will have to be worked out more clearly if we really want a more equitable situation.
Great. Thanks, Kanta. I mean, from my own vantage point, again, one of the things that I have seen repeatedly over the last few decades is that in emergencies, you have a different kind of leverage. You have fear, you have power, you have money thrown at a problem, and you can really force in a certain direction. And then during the interpandemic periods, or between the periods when we really ought to be using that time to advantage, the money disappears, the political will disappears, and it becomes much harder to address issues like access on the long term. And it's further complicated by the point Johnluca raised, which is that the idea of access itself is quite broad, depends on who you talk to. And so I almost see it as not quite a physics issue, but I do see this inconsistent application, this inconsistent leveraging of the ability to really push through some of the answers needed for these issues, which I also believe have to be addressed together. You can't just take them and ignore the other. So I think this comes down to the fourth issue that I wanted to put down, which is a little bit, so what do we do about this? You know, I think we all see these are complicated issues. They're critical issues. But you know, it is incumbent upon us to try to come up with actionable steps for a couple reasons. You know, one of them is that it's clear we don't know when the next event is going to happen. You know, we don't know when COVID is going to be over. We don't know when the next new event is going to come up. And it's also clear, though, that once COVID does begin to resolve, it is simply a situation where decision makers are going to have to go on to other issues. You know, they're not going to be able to spend infinite time on COVID. They are going to move on to other issues. And so in a sense, there genuinely is a window in which certain things can be addressed. So if that's the context, you know, what are maybe some of the operational or scientific or legal or political steps that can be initiated now, you know, while we're still going through COVID, while there is still high attention on these issues, And, maybe if you can even frame your answers about what can we address in the short term, the medium term, the longer term, but things that we should really begin pushing for now. So, Kanta, can I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a wide-ranging, long list. So I'll give you just a few points and maybe we'll come around again. So at my sort of top few picks would be developing and strengthening global surveillance systems and networks and connections with One Health. The last several pathogens have emerged from animal reservoirs. I don't think it's necessarily feasible to go and essentially work up every animal pathogen. So perhaps focusing on the animal-human interface and investing much more in identifying any pathogens across the species barrier and understand what it takes for something like that, something that crosses the species barrier that then goes on to become a more successful at spreading. And then in that same vein, at the operational level, technology transfer. I think that is something that could alleviate some of the inequities that we have. At the scientific level, I think we had some lost opportunities when SARS and MERS were first identified. The vaccines of SARS coronavirus 2 have built on what we learned with those two, but we lost the opportunity to have a coronavirus vaccine licensed. So I would say at this point, we should be thinking about pan-coronavirus vaccines, universal influenza vaccines, and, sort of pick these families of viruses and actually have both drugs and vaccines that will be available rather than us rushing and trying to repurpose drugs desperately. On the legal side, I mean, this is not my field at all, but certainly there's a lot of talk now about waiving intellectual property in the event of pandemic so that there's more ability for technology transfer and sharing. And then coming back again to this issue of addressing inequities and solving kind of vaccine nationalism. So I think the vaccine work has been phenomenal. And I think we will, in the flu world, benefit from the advances with COVID-19. But it's also revealed inequities all over the world. And that's something that in the big picture, we need to find a way to deal with.
Great, thanks, Kanta. Celia, can I turn to you next?
Sure. I think it's also very complex to get to very specific further steps, but I would like to say that I guess a real lessons learned exercise per country would be very important, and also match them per region. Identify the area of opportunity to improve our preparedness and response to pandemic. Sounds very global or general, but we said the same thing every time. And I think it's very important to go back and review those. Implement as much as we can the strategies to close gaps and use international help collaboration to learn from successful experience in different fields of the response to strengthen the preparedness and response plans. And also, we need to help countries with limited capacities to build better preparedness and response, and even to have in advance immediate plans to help them with the response, mapping all the political, social, economical, governance obstacles. There are obstacles to have solutions. If not, we are going to be in the same situation over and over. And at the end, I guess other than this local or regional point of view, there's a big lessons learned that we've been seeing over and over. So we also need global solutions. We need to really implement those global solutions and to think in global solutions and not also in the local solutions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Celia. Josh, can I turn to you for your thoughts?
So I think you asked a great question, which is what can be done now? Because now we're still in the midst of a terrible pandemic, and there's still so many people who are dying, and there's still an urgent need for many of the things that we've been talking about. And so I think building the capacity to respond to COVID-19 now with an eye to the structures and the agreements that will make sense to strengthen even further after the pandemic is really important. I think in the two areas we've been talking about, transparency about data around surveillance and beyond. I just wouldn't limit it to viral surveillance. It's the more complete, data set about the virus, but it's also transparency about vaccines and how well they're working against variants, transparency about therapeutics. I think that this is a moment for, a standards and expectations to be set that are based on, a facilitating global understanding of what's necessary to save lives today. Are, all vaccines the same? Probably not. Which ones are really the most urgent for different situations? Are there vaccines that are working better for certain variants? These are questions that matter now, and sharing data under the right, setting can really make a huge difference and also put us in a position better for future pandemics. Similarly, the opportunity now to share not just vaccine supplies, but vaccine know-how, to build vaccine production capacity in different parts of the world. That's necessary for this pandemic, for the booster shots that'll be necessary for this pandemic, and will also move that idea that, the world is committed on two fronts, to sharing critical information and to helping every country respond to the pandemic. We should be doing both of those now and setting up agreements and structures that can carry forward so that we're not in the same position the next time.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Johnluca.
Yes, so I largely agree on what my colleague said. In particular, now, as Josh said, we are still in the middle of the pandemic. That's why sometimes it's a bit bizarre to think that there's so much political attention in going to negotiate a pandemic treaty that will be maybe ready in 6 years when we are still fighting day by day. So now the attention is all downstream. It's basically, as Josh said, how to better share countermeasures. And so at the cost of being maybe oversimplified, I think that the multilateral platforms that we have, like the famous COVAX revolving around WHO, Gavi, and other actors, is to me is a good step in the right direction to have a more rational and equitable sharing of limited resources. But there is this tension between the investment in that and the very sort of bilateral, more nationalistic approach, which after all is not so illegitimate and not so illogical, because if I were a political leader, I would think of my population to a certain extent. And so the call for global solidarity is powerful, but it's almost like a rational choice dichotomy. If I look more in the midterm, I think we need a set of complementary measures. I agree with Kanta that we need to look much more on prevention of zoonotic spillover. From HIV/AIDS on, most of the grave outbreaks have been of zoonotic origin. So that tells us something, that there is a big gap there. And this gap is also legal and regulatory. At international level, there is no instrument that covers the mapping and reducing the risk of spillover. That's a big gap to fill. The second is, and I still go back to what Kanta was saying, tech transfer and licensing technology, which is the only way to increase manufacturing capacity, to be able to have search capacity, to have capacity in middle-income countries that now is untapped, and so on. And so this discussion about IP waiver, obviously there's a lot of politics, but it will not go away because it talks about a very real problem. And the President Biden sort of general commitment for that has been nothing short of revolutionary and has really changed very much the political discussion. So this independent panel on pandemic prevention and response convened by WHO has just released its report, and it makes a good point. It's been a failure of public policy that we have done billions of dollars in pharmaceutical companies without frankly, any big condition in how they market the products and so on, including in terms of the condition for tech transfer, licensing, and so on. So that's something not to be repeated. If we invest billions of dollars in corporate actors, there's something in return, not only for me, but broadly for global health security. And finally, definitely a global solution is important, but we shouldn't discard the importance of regional approaches, the club approach. We shouldn't be hostages to the most recalcitrant country. If there is a group of countries that is ready to go ahead in terms of commitment, in terms of sharing, in terms of building best practices, I think that's an equally important approach, both in terms of regions. So I think the African CDC and the European CDC offer interesting lessons there, but also what we call like-minded countries that are prepared to go ahead in a more sort of multilateral direction, and then can be catalytic then for more countries that can join the club. So this regional club approach can also be, in certain cases, a good way forward.
I hear a lot of real politics, Johnluca, in your answer, but I think we need to be thinking that way. But I do want to stress, I think that the operative word is now. I mean, it's easy to dissipate energy by talking about things which will take place way in the future, but we really ought to expend as much energy as what can be done now. And this is one of the things I think that we have to learn from the past events, because this is when we do have the attention. And so I hope we can move in that direction. So everybody, it's 20 minutes past 10 now. As you know, the session ends at 10:30. Right now we have 2 questions which have come in. So let me immediately go to those questions. So the first question is, in addition to sharing of data and sharing of virus variants, what mechanisms does the panel recommend for sharing of algorithms for surveillance and risk assessment of future pandemics? Let me go ahead and ask the second question also. And so then you can maybe address either question that you want to, or both. The second question is different. How do we protect low middle income countries on the impact of data sharing accessible to and for profits? Once sequences are shared, how can we protect LMICs from private diagnostic vaccine companies, or ensure that LMICs benefit from the profits gained by private diagnostic and vaccine companies? So 2 different questions. One related to how do we actually share things such as surveillance algorithms and risk assessment, and then the second, how do we really address some of the equity issues related to benefits for in low and middle income countries. And again, let me see which of you might want to go first.
I'm happy to jump into the second one a little bit and just say that I'm not sure I accept the premise that it's that transactional. Like I said before, I think it should be that there's a framework for sharing information and there's a framework for response, and having, all countries benefit from the response. And those 2 things really stand on their own. They're both necessary for a strong global response to a pandemic. And it shouldn't matter where a particular virus emerges for how, those 2 major goals are reached. We should have plans to reach them. And it shouldn't be a lucky thing to have a virus emerge in your area or an unlucky thing to have a virus emerge in your area. It should be that countries both share information and get the benefits of the pandemic response.
Right. Thanks, Josh. I mean, I think the PIP framework, which, really in spirit, I think tries to do that, get away from the transactional to let us reach a kind of fair balance between, the sharing of both of those things. But it is limited to a certain group of viruses, which is a major limitation right now in the real world. But your point is well taken. Somebody else want to? Kanta.
Yeah, I thought I would just comment briefly on the risk assessment. And that is something that has been done for influenza, for zoonotic strains that have, or animal viruses that emerge or are spreading that have certain phenotypes that we're worried about. And both the WHO and initially the CDC and then separately the WHO have set up a very robust system for assessing risk of the emergence of such pathogens in people and the impact if it were to emerge. So this is done with as an international consultative process that involves people with many different types of expertise. And so the experts actually take the information and they essentially provide their assessment on features that they are comfortable assessing. And so, I'm going through this, not that you guys don't necessarily know this, but for the audience as well, in case people aren't aware of this TIPRA tool. So I think that the WHO has shown this leadership in the case of zoonotic or animal influenza viruses, and a similar role could be played by the WHO for something much broader than just influenza. So, gathering together or having a roster of people with the appropriate expertise that could be called upon to assess the risk, both for emergence and for impact, might be very helpful.
Right. Thanks, Kanta. Celia.
Yeah, in the same way, I would like to say that there are documents already that they have been produced by WHO or CDC or other international agencies related to algorithms or risk assessment. I guess we need a program to reinforce that these documents are out there and they need to be implemented in the different countries somehow to the different regions of WHO, maybe here in this side, in this continent, maybe by PAHO, to go more proactive, to let them go, to exercise them and do something like that, at least very in a periodical way, because it's not just that they are there, so we need to be sure that they are using those documents to be much better prepared. And also it goes in the same way that I was mentioning that we need some harmonic parameters. If we are using this document, then most of us, we are going to do it in the same way, or at least in very similar ways. And that's going to give us more reliable information to everybody. And that's very, very important. I wanted to mention that in that part of the question.
Great, thanks, Celia. Johnluca, any points that you want to raise here?
Just on the second question, to agree with you and Josh, that it's not so black and white, and it shouldn't be seen so black and white. We live in a market economy where we need a corporation to produce what we can consider public goods, but still that's the way things go. I think the challenge is the smart amount and intensity of public regulation to make sure that low and middle income countries are not always at the receiving end of rather greedy market dynamics. And so the PIP framework, I think, is a good example of trying to reach that balance of not trying to socialize the production of countermeasures, but using the need to access, in that case, pandemic flu samples with conditions to ensure equitable outcomes, equitable benefits for low and middle income countries. That system still have to be tested. Thank God we haven't had a flu pandemic where WHO start calling on these pledges, and I hope that happens, that those pledges will materialize. But I would favor that kind of approach, at least as a politically realistic in this situation.
So, everyone, I don't see any other, let me check. I don't see any other questions. We are about a minute or two away from the end of this session. I I want to thank each of you for a fantastic discussion. I think you've really highlighted a number of the key issues. And just to add something to this last set of answers that you provided, in listening to you, one of the things that has struck me is that many of these issues, of course, are not new. They've been there for a long time because they're so tough. You know, they're tough to figure out what to do, and they're tough to implement the actual things. But in this situation, it's also clear that we've lost awareness about many of the tools which are available. I think, Kanta, you and Celia were pointing out, in fact, there are things which are available. In fact, there are whole frameworks like the PIP framework, which really is very poorly recognized by many people that it even exists, but it was, at least for its time, a quite successful attempt to marry that fundamental issue of addressing benefits and viruses and information in a non-transactional way. And, you know, I think that Josh has made the point that we have to get away from a transactional approach. It's just not going to be good enough. But I think at the same time, it's very clear that COVID has highlighted that there are new issues that we have to grapple with. You know, the technologies have changed, and that in and of itself has created new questions that we have to address. And I think if we're going to have a couple of hundred companies making vaccines, the issue again that Josh raised, that regulatory sharing, is really critical. You know, but I think that maybe one of the fundamental issues that we have to deal with now is what do we actually have available, and then what are the new issues that we have to deal with, and that we can maybe begin to have a little bit of clarity on that, because that is not a political issue. That is simply taking stock of what is old and what is new. But at the end of the day, what I have thought most about in my career in this area is how do we actually deal with these issues when we're not in an emergency situation? The emergency situation disappears, and we have to grapple with the issues. But I think that you have given us some potential ways to really move now, where we can focus attention now. So this has been very useful. So we are successfully only a minute over time. Again, I want to thank each of you. This is the end of day one. There's day two, there's day three. So everybody in the audience is invited to join the next 2 days of discussion. And I think we're done for the day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.